I am Igor, 68 years old and a retired police detective. Those instincts from 30 years on, the force saved my life last spring. I always had a close relationship with my son Thomas, but something about his wife Amanda never sat right with me. What was supposed to be a joyful family gathering to celebrate their pregnancy news turned into a nightmare that exposed a shocking truth. If you are watching this from your living room, give this video a like and subscribe to hear how trusting my gut revealed a shocking family secret that nearly cost someone their life. Thomas was always my pride and joy. From the moment he was born, we had a connection that was unbreakable. As he grew up, we spent countless weekends fishing at Lake Michigan. I taught him how to bait a hook when he was just 5 years old, and by the time he was 12, he was out fishing me regularly. We attended Chicago Bears games together, even during those disappointing seasons when the stadium was half empty. Those moments cemented our bond as father and son. Thomas was not only athletic but also incredibly intelligent. He graduated at the top of his high school class and earned a full scholarship to Northwestern University. I still remember the day he called to tell me he had been accepted to medical school. The pride I felt knowing my son would become a doctor was indescribable. I had spent my life putting criminals behind bars, and now my son would be saving lives. After completing his residency, Thomas took a position at Chicago Memorial Hospital in the emergency department. He thrived in the fast-paced environment, and his colleagues respected his quick thinking and steady hands. It was there, during a particularly hectic night shift, that he met Amanda. Amanda worked as a pharmaceutical specialist at the hospital. According to Thomas, they met when she corrected a medication dosage he had prescribed. Rather than being offended, Thomas was impressed by her knowledge and attention to detail. They began dating shortly after, and within 6 months, Thomas brought her home to meet me. I still remember their first visit to my house in the suburbs. Amanda arrived wearing an expensive-looking dress and carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than I would ever spend. She was polite and engaging, asking thoughtful questions about my career and seeming genuinely interested in my answers. Thomas looked at her with such adoration that I was happy for him, despite a nagging feeling I could not quite place. Their wedding 3 years ago was an elaborate affair at one of the most expensive venues in Chicago. Amanda had insisted on no expense being spared, despite Thomas mentioning his concern about starting their marriage with such debt. During the reception, I overheard Amanda speaking sharply to a waitress about the timing of the meal service. The contrast between her warm public persona and that brief glimpse of coldness triggered my first real red flag. After they married, Thomas began missing our regular Sunday dinners. When he did visit, Amanda was always with him, never allowing him to come alone. She would dominate conversations, often interrupting Thomas when he tried to speak. I noticed how he would look to her before answering any question, as if seeking permission. My son, who had always been confident and outspoken, was becoming a shadow of himself. About a year into their marriage, Amanda began asking pointed questions about my financial situation. She wanted to know about my retirement pension, whether I had investments, and if I had updated my will since my wife passed away. I deflected these questions, but her persistence was unsettling. She often mentioned the large house I lived in alone and suggested it might be too much for me to maintain at my age. After their visits, I noticed small items missing from my home. Nothing valuable enough to report to the police, but sentimental objects like the watch my father had given me and a small silver box that had belonged to my late wife. When I mentioned the missing items to Thomas, he seemed embarrassed and changed the subject quickly. What disturbed me most was Amanda's fascination with my old cases, particularly those involving poisonings. During one dinner, she asked detailed questions about a case from the 90s where a woman had slowly poisoned her husband with antifreeze in his evening tea. The gleam in her eyes as I described the symptoms made me uncomfortable enough that I stopped sharing stories from my detective days. I attempted to discuss my concerns with Thomas privately, suggesting we meet for lunch without Amanda. He agreed initially, but called to cancel an hour before, saying Amanda needed him at home. When I tried again, he accused me of not giving Amanda a fair chance and insisted I was being paranoid due to my years as a detective. His dismissal hurt, but I decided to back off rather than damage our relationship further. Last winter, after eating a casserole Amanda had brought over, I experienced severe stomach pain and vomiting that lasted for days. My doctor diagnosed food poisoning, but I could not shake the suspicion that something more sinister had occurred, especially when Amanda called repeatedly asking detailed questions about my symptoms. Then came the announcement that changed everything. Thomas called to say that Amanda was pregnant and they wanted to host a family gathering to share the news in person. Despite my misgivings about Amanda, the thought of becoming a grandfather filled me with joy. I vowed to myself that I would make a genuine effort to mend my relationship with Amanda for the sake of my grandchild. Family meant everything to me, and I wanted to be present in my grandchild's life without tension. As the gathering approached, I bought an expensive baby gift and prepared myself to be warm and supportive. Little did I know that the event would reveal a truth far darker than I had imagined, even in my most suspicious moments as a detective. The day of the gathering was unusually warm for spring in Chicago. I arrived at Thomas and Amanda's suburban home at exactly 2 in the afternoon, carrying a large gift bag containing a handcrafted wooden rocking horse I had spent months making in my garage workshop. Their house was an imposing 2-story with perfectly manicured landscaping that always looked as if no one actually lived there. Despite the cheerful yellow balloons tied to the mailbox and a welcome banner hanging over the front door, the atmosphere inside felt strained. Thomas greeted me with a hug that seemed mechanical, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. Amanda, however, was uncharacteristically warm, taking the gift bag with exclamations of gratitude and insisting I take the most comfortable seat in the living room. I was not the first to arrive. Amanda's parents, Walter and Judith, were already seated in the dining room. Walter was a tall, distinguished-looking man with silver hair who had made his fortune in real estate. Judith was a petite woman with carefully maintained blonde hair and a permanent expression of mild anxiety. They nodded politely but seemed uncomfortable, Judith repeatedly glancing at her daughter with what looked like concern. My daughter Laura arrived shortly after me. 5 years younger than Thomas, she had always been the peacemaker in our family. She worked as a kindergarten teacher and had a gift for reading people that sometimes exceeded even my trained detective instincts. She gave me a significant look as she entered, and I knew immediately that she sensed the tension too. While Amanda was arranging appetizers on the coffee table, I overheard heated whispers coming from the kitchen. Pretending to look for the bathroom, I moved closer to the doorway. "You promised you would handle this differently," Thomas was saying, his voice tight with stress. "My father is trying. Can you please just give him a chance?" "Do not tell me how to manage this situation," Amanda responded, her tone completely different from the sugary voice she had used with me moments earlier. "Everything is going according to plan. Just play your part." When Thomas emerged from the kitchen, his face was flushed, and he avoided eye contact with everyone. Amanda followed with a platter of finger sandwiches, her smile firmly back in place as if the exchange had never happened. While Amanda was busy arranging food, Laura pulled me aside near the fireplace. "Something is off with her, Dad," she whispered. "Thomas called me crying last week. He would not say what was wrong, but I have never heard him like that before." Before I could respond, Amanda approached with 2 glasses of wine, handing one to Laura, and effectively ending our private conversation. Throughout the afternoon, I observed Thomas carefully. My son looked exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes and a noticeable weight loss since I had last seen him 2 months ago. He spoke little and seemed to be going through the motions of hosting rather than genuinely celebrating. After an hour of awkward small talk and forced laughter, Amanda stood and made an announcement. "I have prepared a special tea with health benefits for the grandfather-to-be," she said, looking directly at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "It has herbs that promote longevity and clarity of mind. I read that men over 65 should drink it daily." The specificity of the offer struck me as odd. Why would she prepare something only for me? As if reading my thoughts, she quickly added, "Of course, I can make some for everyone if they would like, but I prepared this cup specially for Igor." I watched her retreating back as she went to the kitchen, noting the quick glance she exchanged with her mother. Judith's expression was unreadable, but she suddenly became very interested in her fingernails. When Amanda returned, she carried a single delicate teacup on a saucer. The liquid inside was an unusual reddish-brown color. She placed it directly in my hands, her fingers lingering on mine as she transferred the cup. "Drink it while it is at the perfect temperature," she insisted, remaining standing over me as if waiting for me to comply immediately. I smiled and thanked her, but my internal alarms were blaring. 20 years as a homicide detective had taught me to recognize when something did not add up. Was I being paranoid? Was my dislike of Amanda coloring my judgment? Or were my instincts picking up on a genuine threat? "I need to use the restroom first," I said, placing the untouched tea on the side table. "Be right back." In the privacy of the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and took several deep breaths. I had two choices: confront my suspicions directly and potentially damage my relationship with Thomas permanently if I was wrong, or remain alert and gather more information. Years of investigation had taught me that accusations without evidence often backfire. I decided to proceed with caution but keep my guard up. When I returned to the living room, Amanda was watching the teacup I had left behind with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. When I reclaimed my seat, Amanda immediately pushed the teacup closer to me. "Please try it while it is still warm," she said with an insistent smile. "I selected these herbs specifically with your health in mind." I lifted the cup and pretended to take a small sip, keeping my lips closed. The tea had an unusual viscosity, slightly thicker than normal tea should be. What struck me most was the smell, a distinctive bitter almond scent that triggered an immediate memory. 15 years ago I had worked a case involving a chemistry professor who had poisoned his research assistant. The autopsy had revealed cyanide as the cause of death. During the investigation, I had learned that cyanide often gives off a bitter almond smell, though not everyone can detect it. It was genetic, the medical examiner had explained, and only about 60% of the population could smell it at all. My hand nearly trembled as I placed the cup back on the saucer. Amanda had not moved, her eyes fixed on my face as if waiting for a reaction. "How does it taste? Is it bitter?" "Some people find these herbs a bit strong at first," she said, her voice higher than usual. "It is interesting," I replied non-committally. "Very unique flavor profile. Thank you for thinking of me." Amanda continued to hover until Thomas called her from the kitchen, asking for help with something. As soon as she left, I examined the tea more closely. The color was off, and tiny particles floated near the bottom, partially dissolved. When Amanda returned, her behavior shifted suddenly. "I think everyone should try my special tea," she announced. "It has such wonderful properties." She hurried to the kitchen and returned with a tray holding 5 more cups. I watched carefully as she distributed them, noting that none had the same distinctive color as mine. Was I imagining things? No. Years of training had taught me to trust my observation skills. As everyone made polite conversation, I noticed Amanda kept glancing between me and my still mostly full cup, with growing impatience. The doorbell rang, and Amanda excused herself to answer it. This was my opportunity. With everyone distracted by the new arrival and neighbor dropping off a gift for the baby, I quickly switched my cup with Judith's, who had placed her still untouched tea on the coffee table while she showed Laura pictures on her phone. The weight of what I was doing hit me hard. If my suspicions were unfounded, I was being irrationally paranoid and potentially putting Judith at risk of whatever imaginary threat I had concocted. If I was right, I was knowingly allowing Amanda's mother to consume something potentially dangerous. But my instincts were screaming at me that something was very wrong, and I needed evidence before making accusations. Amanda returned and immediately scanned the room, her eyes landing on what she thought was my cup in front of Judith. A flash of something dark crossed her face before her pleasant mask returned. Thomas emerged from the kitchen with a plate of cookies. "Is everyone enjoying the tea Amanda made? She has been really into herbal remedies lately." "Delicious," Judith replied, picking up what she believed was her cup, the one I had originally been given. She took a generous sip while Amanda watched with an expression I could only describe as anticipation. For the next few minutes, I maintained a stream of light conversation about the upcoming baseball season with Walter, who seemed eager for any distraction from the awkward family dynamics. Inside, however, I was counting the seconds, wondering if I had made a terrible mistake. Laura was telling a story about one of her kindergarten students when I noticed Judith adjusting her collar, as if suddenly uncomfortable. She took another sip of the tea, emptying the cup. Amanda's eyes darted between Judith and me, a furrow forming on her brow when she saw I had barely touched what she now thought was my cup. The room fell silent for a moment. Walter asked Judith if she was feeling all right. She had become flushed and was breathing more rapidly. She waved off his concern, but her hand trembled visibly. "It is a bit warm in here," she said, her voice sounding strained. "Could someone open a window?" Thomas stood to adjust the thermostat, but my attention remained fixed on Judith. Something was very wrong, and the next few minutes would confirm whether my worst fears were justified. For 5 excruciating minutes, conversation continued in fits and starts. Thomas attempted to discuss their plans for the nursery, while Laura asked Amanda about her due date. I contributed only when directly addressed, my attention split between maintaining appearances and monitoring Judith. The first unmistakable sign came when Judith suddenly clutched her stomach, wincing mid-sentence. Walter placed his hand on her shoulder, concern etching deeper lines into his already weathered face. "Are you all right, dear?" he asked, as Judith's breathing became more labored. "Just a little indigestion," she managed to say, but her face had taken on a grayish pallor that contradicted her reassurance. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead despite the room being comfortably cool. Thomas, noticing the change in his mother-in-law, set his cup down and moved toward her. "Judith, are you feeling unwell? Would you like to lie down for a moment?" Before she could respond, Judith suddenly stood up, her eyes wide with panic. "I cannot breathe properly," she gasped, her hand at her throat. "Something is wrong." The teacup she had been holding crashed to the floor, shattering on the hardwood as she collapsed back into her chair, her body going rigid before beginning to convulse. "Mom!" Amanda screamed, the sound more theatrical than genuinely concerned to my trained ear. Thomas immediately switched into doctor mode, rushing to Judith's side and easing her to the floor away from the furniture. "Call 911, he commanded, checking her pulse as Walter stood frozen in shock. Laura grabbed her phone and made the call, her kindergarten teacher calmness taking over as she clearly relayed the address and symptoms to the emergency dispatcher. Judith's convulsions worsened, foam appearing at the corners of her mouth. Walter finally broke from his stupor and dropped to his knees beside his wife, grasping her hand as Thomas loosened her clothing and placed her in the recovery position. "What is happening to her?" Walter cried, looking between Thomas and Amanda. Suddenly, his expression changed from confusion to fury as he turned to his daughter. "What was in that tea? Did you do this to her?" Amanda's face drained of color. "What? No, how could you even think that?" "The tea," I said firmly, standing up. "Thomas, I believe Judith has been poisoned." All eyes turned to me as I explained what I had observed, the bitter almond smell, the strange consistency, Amanda's insistence that I drink it immediately, and most damning of all, the cup switch I had performed. Amanda's shock appeared genuine as realization dawned. "You switched the cups? That tea was for you, not my mother." The words tumbled out before she could stop them. The room went deathly silent, except for Judith's labored breathing. Thomas stared at his wife, comprehension and horror washing over his face in waves. "What did you put in the tea, Amanda?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nothing. I mean, it was just herbs." Amanda's denial crumbled as she backed away from her husband's accusing stare. "This is ridiculous. Igor has always hated me. He is trying to turn you against me." Walter lunged toward Amanda but was held back by Laura. "If my wife dies, I will make sure you rot in prison for the rest of your life," he spat. The wail of sirens announced the arrival of emergency services. Thomas provided swift clinical details to the paramedics who rushed in moments later. Suspected cyanide poisoning based on symptoms and odor. Onset approximately 7 minutes ago following ingestion. Patient is 64 years old, with no prior cardiac issues. The paramedics worked with practiced efficiency, administering oxygen and preparing Judith for transport. One paramedic radioed ahead to the hospital to prepare the cyanide poisoning protocol and antidote kit. As they were loading Judith onto the stretcher, 2 police officers entered the house. The younger officer began taking statements while his partner secured the scene, placing the broken teacup fragments into an evidence bag. I identified myself as a retired detective and calmly explained what had transpired. The officers separated everyone, taking preliminary statements in different rooms. I could hear Amanda's increasingly hysterical denials from the kitchen, contrasting sharply with Walter's anguished questions as he prepared to follow the ambulance. Thomas sat alone on the couch, his head in his hands, the weight of betrayal crushing down on him. Laura sat beside him, her arm around his shoulders, murmuring words of comfort that seemed wholly inadequate for the situation. As the chaos continued around us, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and horror. My suspicions about Amanda had been justified in the worst possible way. But at what cost? Judith was fighting for her life. Thomas's marriage and future were imploding, and a family was being torn apart before my eyes. One of the officers approached me, notebook in hand. "Sir, I understand you switched the cups. Can you explain why you would do that instead of simply warning everyone or refusing to drink the tea?" It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself since Judith collapsed. In my years as a detective, I learned that accusations without evidence rarely lead to justice, I replied. I needed to know if my suspicions were correct. I never imagined she would have used something that acted so quickly or violently. I thought at worst it might cause discomfort that could be documented. The officer nodded without comment and continued taking notes. More police arrived, including a detective I recognized from my precinct before retirement. The house had transformed from a site of family celebration to a crime scene in less than an hour. As Judith was wheeled out to the ambulance, Walter following close behind, the full impact of what had just happened struck me. My daughter-in-law had tried to murder me, and in trying to protect myself, I had instead endangered someone else. The case was no longer theoretical, it had become intensely, horrifyingly personal. The waiting room at Chicago Memorial Hospital was a study in strained silence. Walter paced endlessly, stopping only when doctors appeared with updates. Thomas sat motionless, staring at the wall, while Laura made necessary phone calls to family members. I remained apart from the group, my presence both necessary and uncomfortable. 3 hours after admission, the attending physician finally approached with news. "Mrs. Preston is stabilized," he announced, addressing Walter. "We confirmed cyanide poisoning and administered the hydroxycobalamin antidote protocol in time. She is responding well, but she will need to remain in intensive care for at least 48 hours for observation. There may be some neurological effects we will need to monitor." The collective relief was palpable, though no one celebrated. Walter broke down, tears flowing freely as he thanked the doctor repeatedly. Thomas excused himself, disappearing down the hall to compose himself. Meanwhile, at the house, the police investigation was in full swing. Detective Marshall, my former colleague, called to inform me that they had secured a search warrant and were collecting evidence from Thomas and Amanda's home. Amanda had been taken to the precinct for formal questioning but was not yet under arrest. "She is asking for a lawyer," Marshall told me. "Claims this is all a misunderstanding or potentially your attempt to frame her due to family tensions." I was not surprised. Amanda had always been calculating. Without a confession, the case would rely on forensic evidence and witness testimony. When we were finally allowed to see Judith, she was conscious but weak, an array of monitoring equipment surrounding her bed. Walter clutched her hand as if afraid she might slip away if he let go. "The tea," Judith whispered, her voice raspy from the intubation she had undergone during treatment. Why would she do this? No one had an answer. The question hung heavy in the air, impossible to address adequately. Later that evening, Detective Marshall called again. "We found something you should know about," he said. The text discovered extensive internet searches on Amanda's laptop about various poisons, their effects, and detection methods. Most concerning were specific searches about cyanide, its availability in certain fruit seeds, and methods of extraction. These searches date back nearly 6 months. This information, while damning, raised more questions than it answered. What had triggered Amanda's plan? Why now? And why target me specifically? The next morning brought another shock. The detective assigned to the case requested we all come to the station for formal interviews. Upon arrival, we learned Amanda had finally broken down during questioning and confessed, but her confession revealed a web of deception beyond what any of us had imagined. Thomas and I were permitted to observe the recorded confession from another room. Amanda sat composed, her lawyer beside her, as she coolly detailed her plan. She had accumulated significant gambling debts, unknown to Thomas, nearly $300,000. With creditors threatening legal action, she had become desperate. "Igor was the obstacle," she stated flatly to the detective. "Thomas is the sole beneficiary of his father's estate. The house alone is worth over $1 million in that neighborhood, not to mention the pension and investments. With Igor gone, Thomas would inherit everything, and our financial problems would be solved." I watched my son's face crumple as Amanda continued, revealing that the pregnancy announcement had been entirely fabricated to create a reason for the family gathering and to ensure Thomas would not leave her after his father's planned death. I needed everyone there to establish that many people had access to the tea, she explained. I would have suggested Igor's heart condition or age as factors after his death. But Mr. Petrov does not have a heart condition, the detective noted. Amanda's smile was chilling. Medical records can be altered when you work in a hospital pharmacy. The most disturbing revelation came when the detective asked if this had been her first attempt to harm me. No, Amanda admitted after consulting with her lawyer, who appeared to be advising a full confession in hopes of a plea deal. I had been adding small amounts of ethylene glycol to food I prepared for him over the past several months. It was too slow, though. He only got sick enough to see a doctor once, and they diagnosed food poisoning. Thomas stood abruptly and left the room. I remained, needing to hear every detail of how my daughter-in-law had methodically plotted my death. The investigation expanded rapidly after Amanda's confession. Forensic teams found the remaining cyanide in a locked box in Amanda's home office, along with research materials on poisons and their effects. They also discovered notes detailing my routine and eating habits. More shocking was the revelation that police had reopened an investigation into the death of Amanda's former supervisor at her previous hospital job in Boston. The woman had died 3 years earlier from what had been ruled natural causes, but occurred shortly after she and Amanda had a significant workplace dispute. Thomas filed for divorce immediately, the paperwork expedited by his lawyer. He moved in with Laura temporarily, unable to return to the house he had shared with Amanda. Walter and Judith, once they understood the full scope of their daughter's actions, made the painful decision to cooperate fully with the prosecution. "She is our daughter, and we love her," Walter told me privately, his voice breaking. "But she attempted to murder you and nearly killed her own mother instead. We cannot defend that." A court-ordered psychological evaluation diagnosed Amanda with antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features. The evaluator noted her remarkable lack of remorse and her primary concern for how the charges would affect her own future rather than the harm she had caused. The local news covered the story extensively, dubbing Amanda the poisonous pharmacist. For weeks, reporters camped outside my house and Thomas's workplace, hungry for additional details about the family drama that had nearly turned deadly. In the midst of this chaos, my guilt over Judith's condition weighed heavily on me. Though she continued to improve physically, the doctors warned that she might experience long-term neurological effects, including tremors and memory issues. When I finally visited her alone, I expected anger. Instead, she reached for my hand with her still trembling one. "You did not know it would be me who drank it," she said simply. "You were trying to protect yourself and find proof. I would have done the same." Her forgiveness, while welcome, did not erase my sense of responsibility. If I had spoken up sooner about my suspicions, perhaps none of this would have happened. Yet I knew from experience that without evidence, my concerns would have been dismissed as the paranoia of an aging detective with an overactive imagination. As the legal proceedings advanced, our fractured family attempted to find a new normal amid the wreckage Amanda had left behind. Thomas threw himself into his work, taking extra shifts at the hospital as if trying to atone for his failure to see his wife's true nature. Laura became the family's emotional anchor, organizing Sunday dinners where we could all be together without discussing the case. And I watched helplessly as my son struggled with questions I knew all too well from my years working with victims of betrayal. How had he missed the signs? How could he have loved someone capable of such calculation and cruelty? Would he ever be able to trust again? The preliminary court hearings began 6 weeks after the incident. Amanda appeared in court wearing a conservative navy blue dress, her hair pulled back in a modest ponytail, a stark contrast to her usual stylish appearance. Her lawyer had clearly advised her on presenting a sympathetic image to the judge. Bail was denied due to the premeditated nature of the attempted murder, and the risk that Amanda might flee, given her extensive knowledge of false identification methods discovered in her search history. She remained in county custody, separated from the general prison population due to her high-profile case status. I was called to testify at the preliminary hearing, explaining in detail my observations and actions on the day of the poisoning. Under cross-examination, Amanda's defense attorney suggested an alternative theory, that I had planned the entire incident out of resentment toward Amanda and a desire to separate her from my son. "Is it not true, Mr. Petrov," the attorney asked, "that you frequently expressed displeasure about your son's marriage to the defendant?" "I had concerns," I admitted carefully, but I never wished her harm. Yet you chose to switch a cup you claimed to believe was poisoned with one intended for another person, instead of simply alerting everyone present to your suspicions? The question hung in the air, and I felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom. I needed evidence, I replied. Without proof, my concerns would have been dismissed as the paranoia of an old man. I never anticipated the poison would act so quickly or severely, or I would have taken different action. Thomas's testimony proved even more difficult to witness. He spoke of Amanda's gradual isolation of him from family and friends, her increasing interest in my financial affairs, and the discovery that she had been monitoring my medical appointments without my knowledge. His voice broke when he described finding out that the pregnancy announcements had been fabricated, complete with falsified medical records Amanda had created using her hospital access. She knew how much I wanted to be a father, Thomas said quietly. She used that desire to manipulate me and create an occasion to gather the family. Judith's testimony, delivered via video from her rehabilitation facility where she was recovering from the lingering effects of the poisoning, left many in the courtroom visibly moved. She described persistent tremors in her hands that might never fully resolve, memory lapses, and ongoing fatigue that had forced her early retirement from her position as a school administrator. The prosecution built a methodical case, presenting evidence of premeditation through Amanda's internet searches, her acquisition of cyanide by extracting it from apple seeds using techniques researched online, and her creation of detailed notes on how to avoid detection. What none of us expected was Amanda's sudden decision to change her plea to guilty midway through the trial. Her lawyer cited new evidence the prosecution had uncovered, a journal in which Amanda had outlined multiple scenarios for eliminating me, including staged accidents and other poisons that would mimic natural causes. Rather than allow this journal to be entered into evidence and face the maximum sentence, Amanda accepted a plea deal, 20 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after serving 15 years. The deal spared us all the continued trauma of a full trial, but left many questions unanswered and emotions unresolved. The sentencing hearing was brief but powerful. Each of us had the opportunity to provide victim impact statements. Walter spoke of the betrayal as a parent, struggling to reconcile the daughter he had raised with the woman who had coldly planned a murder and inadvertently poisoned her own mother. Thomas chose not to speak, providing a written statement instead which the prosecutor read aloud. In it, he described the destruction of his ability to trust and his ongoing nightmares in which he failed to save Judith in time. "The person I married never existed," the statement concluded. "She was a fabrication as false as the pregnancy she used to manipulate me and my family." When it was my turn, I spoke directly to Amanda. "I am a retired detective who failed to act decisively on my suspicions," I said. "That failure nearly cost Judith her life, and it is something I will carry forever. But you are a healthcare professional who violated every oath you took. You used your knowledge not to heal, but to harm. That choice defines you now, not anything I or anyone else might have done." Amanda's apology, when she finally spoke, seemed rehearsed and hollow. She expressed regret for the pain she had caused, but framed much of her statement around her own struggles with gambling addiction and financial pressure. Not once did she make eye contact with any of us. The judge was unmoved by her performance. "You abused your pharmaceutical knowledge to calculate a murder," he stated while delivering the sentence. "You betrayed your family, your profession, and basic human decency. 20 years is the consequence of your choices." As Amanda was led away in handcuffs, Thomas watched with an expression of emptiness rather than anger or sadness. Later, he confessed to me that he felt nothing at all, a numbness that worried me more than grief would have. In the months that followed, Thomas spiraled into depression. He took a leave of absence from the hospital, unable to face the whispers and stares from colleagues who had known Amanda. He moved into my house temporarily, sleeping most days away and barely eating. Therapy sessions seemed to help minimally, the therapist explaining that betrayal trauma of this magnitude would take significant time to process. I found myself in the unfamiliar role of caretaker for my adult son. I prepared meals he barely touched, gently encouraged him to join me for short walks, and sat in silence with him when words failed us both. One night, after he had finally fallen asleep, I found myself weeping in my kitchen not just for what had happened, but for my failure to prevent it. Had I spoken up sooner, more forcefully, perhaps Thomas might have seen Amanda's true nature before they married. Had I trusted my instincts and confronted her directly about my suspicions, Perhaps Judith would not now be in physical therapy 3 times a week, learning to write again with hands that trembled uncontrollably. Walter and Judith, remarkably, maintained their relationship with Thomas despite everything. They regularly invited us for dinner, creating a strange new family unit born from tragedy. Walter took early retirement to care for Judith, and their devotion to each other provided a reminder that genuine love existed even in the shadow of Amanda's manipulation. Thomas, Laura, and I began attending family therapy together, learning to navigate our new reality and the complicated emotions that surfaced unexpectedly. The therapist helped us understand that healing would not be linear and that good days would be interspersed with setbacks. The first Thanksgiving after Amanda's sentencing was particularly difficult. The empty chair at the table seemed to represent not just Amanda's absence, but the loss of the future Thomas had once imagined. He excused himself midway through the meal, and I found him sitting in my car in the garage, staring blankly through the windshield. "I keep thinking about the children we plan to have," he said when I joined him. "Were they ever real to her, or just another manipulation?" I had no answer that could ease his pain. I simply sat beside him until he was ready to return inside, my presence the only comfort I could offer. 6 months after the sentencing, Thomas reluctantly agreed to a dinner with a colleague from work. It was not a date, he insisted, just 2 friends having a meal. But it represented his first tentative step toward rebuilding a life beyond the wreckage of his marriage. I continued to struggle with my own guilt, especially on days when Judith's symptoms were more pronounced. Despite everyone's assurances that I had acted reasonably given the circumstances, I could not shake the knowledge that my decision to switch the cups had directly resulted in her injuries. "You need to forgive yourself," Laura told me one evening. "You did not poison anyone. Amanda did. Your actions may not have been perfect, but your intentions were to protect yourself and gather evidence." Her words made logical sense, but logic does little to quiet the voice of guilt in the small hours of the night when sleep remains elusive. 2 years have passed since the day Amanda served that poisoned tea. In some ways, it seems like a lifetime ago. In others, the memory remains as fresh as yesterday. Our family has been irrevocably changed, yet we have survived in ways I could not have imagined during those dark early days. Judith has regained about 80% of her former health. The tremors in her hands have diminished with extensive therapy, though they become more pronounced when she is tired or stressed. Her short-term memory issues persist, requiring her to keep detailed notes and reminders, but her sharp wit and kind heart remain intact. Walter has become her devoted partner in recovery, accompanying her to every appointment and celebrating each milestone, no matter how small. Perhaps most surprisingly, Walter and Judith have become surrogate parents to Thomas in many ways. Rather than allowing the poisoning to drive a wedge between them, they have embraced him more fully, understanding that he too was Amanda's victim. They host Sunday dinners at their condo downtown, creating new traditions to replace the ones tainted by painful memories. Thomas and I have rebuilt our relationship on stronger foundations. The walls that Amanda constructed between us have crumbled, allowing us to communicate more openly than we have since his childhood. We fish together again on weekends sometimes, though now we talk more than we cast our lines. After 18 months of intensive therapy, Thomas began dating again cautiously. Catherine is a pediatric surgeon he met through a hospital fundraiser. She understands his hesitancy and respects the slow pace at which their relationship is developing. I have met her several times and see how her patience and transparency are exactly what Thomas needs to learn to trust again. Last month, Thomas mentioned Amanda without tensing up for the first time. We were sorting through old photographs, and he came across their wedding picture. "I can see the signs now," he said quietly, studying her face in the image. "The calculation behind her smile. The way she is holding me like a prize rather than a partner. I was so blind." "Love is supposed to be trusting," I replied. "No one expects their spouse to be planning their parents' murder." Thomas managed a small smile at that. I used to blame myself entirely. Now I understand that while I missed some warning signs, the capacity for such calculated harm was entirely hers. That moment represented a significant breakthrough in his healing. The ability to reflect on Amanda without being consumed by anger or self-recrimination marked a turning point in his recovery. For my part, I have finally begun to forgive myself for the cup swap that endangered Judith. It took many conversations with my therapist to accept that I had made the best decision I could with the information available to me. My detective instincts had been correct about the threat, if not about the specific poison or its speed of action. Judith herself has been instrumental in my journey toward self-forgiveness. During a private lunch 6 months ago, she took my hand and spoke words I desperately needed to hear. "Igor, in your place, with your suspicions, I would have done exactly the same thing. You were trying to protect yourself and gather evidence against someone you believed was dangerous. You were right. The outcome was unfortunate, but the alternative might have been your death, with Amanda never facing justice." The wisdom in her forgiveness broke something open in me, allowing the beginning of healing. Our family has instituted new traditions based on painful lessons learned. We now practice radical honesty with one another, addressing concerns directly rather than letting them fester. When Thomas first introduced Catherine to the family, we established an open communication policy where questions and boundaries could be discussed without judgment. I have learned that addressing red flags immediately is not paranoia, it is protection. Too often we dismiss our instincts out of fear of seeming impolite or causing conflict. That social conditioning nearly cost me my life and did cause lasting harm to Judith. I no longer hesitate to speak up when something feels wrong, even at the risk of temporary discomfort. The experience has changed how I view family bonds as well. I once believed that family connections were primarily determined by blood or marriage. Now I understand that true family is built on trust, respect, and genuine care. Walter and Judith, who could have blamed me or withdrawn after the poisoning, instead drew closer, showing what real family means. My volunteer work at the Senior Center now includes monthly talks on personal safety and trusting one's instincts. I share my story carefully, without sensationalism, focusing on the importance of acknowledging concerns rather than dismissing them. Many older adults face similar situations with caregivers or family members, and they find comfort in knowing they are not alone in their experiences of having their concerns dismissed as paranoia or confusion. The complex nature of forgiveness has been perhaps the most challenging lesson. Forgiving does not mean forgetting or excusing. I will never excuse what Amanda did, nor forget the harm she caused. But I have learned to release the power her actions held over our family's daily lives. We acknowledge what happened without allowing it to define us or determine our future happiness. The final lesson I carry forward is the balance between vigilance and paranoia. As a detective, I was trained to be suspicious, to look for inconsistencies and hidden motives. In retirement, I struggled to turn off that professional lens, and sometimes my suspicions alienated others, including Thomas. Amanda's actions validated my concerns, but also taught me that vigilance must be tempered with openness and a willingness to give people a chance to prove themselves. Trust is indeed precious, but verification is wise. This philosophy now guides our family as we move forward, creating new memories to stand alongside the painful ones. What have you learned about trusting your instincts in challenging situations? Have you ever faced a moment where speaking up might have changed the outcome of events in your life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, give it a like and subscribe for more real-life experiences that remind us to value and protect those we love. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember to cherish your genuine relationships. They are truly the foundation that sustains us through life's darkest moments.